as an alternative to simply not making any statement as a CEO and backing away from this, what is the impetus for a CEO to actually take this more seriously?
Say nothing and do nothing if you can't just do anything, because the cancel culture will get you. That is my personal belief. What will happen to companies if they put something on the table and they cannot deliver it?
But I guess that's not what I'm framing. I'm framing, why aren't they putting something more substantive in play? Is there a good reason not to? Could be fiscal, or is there something that needs to get reframed for leaders?
David's gonna say something profound, but I'm gonna say something.
I was just going to say I don't agree with George, because we and as did Nike, actually, we set out our goals and we were public about them, and every year we stated our goals, and we, in our financial report, we had a combined report, we would state how we were doing against those goals. We were also attacked on many things, and we were criticized for doing many things that we said, you know what, this is not material to our business and we're not taking it on. And again, that goes back to materiality. Our impacts, both positive and negative, are these things, and we're going to focus on these things. And I think if you set goals and are transparent about them, if they are tightly integrated with your impacts and your materiality, you will not get canceled. It's when you start stepping beyond that the canceling happens.
As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode in the ongoing discussion of the business of retail. I'm David Ian Gray, and joining me are regulars, George Minikakis, Gary Newbury, Craig Patterson, Christine Cowan. And as we do from time to time, today we have a guest co-host, David Labistour, the former CEO of MEC, prior to that, head of merch there, and with a long history in global retail and brands, and is on the board of Aritzia. And with David in hand, I think this is the episode where we want to go a little deeper in this notion of purpose and sustainability. For those of you who are first-time listeners, welcome to the Business of Retail podcast. May I suggest that you hit subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, as we publish twice a month, and you don't want to miss us. You can also follow along on LinkedIn, and we have, of course, the businessofretail.ca website. So today we're going to take on the topic of purpose and sustainability. And that seems like a pretty obvious choice these days with all the news of social justice, et cetera, et cetera. But more deeply than that, many retailers are struggling with the idea of purpose. They're either trying to determine how to make it relevant to the business. How do they grapple with this general notion of sustainability, social justice, environmental sustainability, and not just have it as a bolt-on. Others, meanwhile, are increasingly making bold claims about their own sustainability practices or environmental goals, often as goals and not something they're achieving, in order to appear relevant to their audiences. And in doing so, they risk greenwashing claims. So there's a balancing act involved in this. So today we're going to get into the practical measures that retail leaders, CEOs, need to deploy to ensure they're on a transparent path to success, not only for their stakeholders, but the business itself. So with David joining us today, David, why don't we just start with you? Just jump in terms of how your background has kind of led you to where you're at today, and how you've sort of formulated your own views on this, because I know that they're not your typical. What we're going to get from you today is going to be a little contentious. It's not necessarily going to be the typical view. So maybe you could give us a running start just by telling us how you got started juxtaposing into these issues in your leadership career.
Oh, David, it's a long story. And I think I've been fortunate to have experiences along the way that have shaped the way I think about things. Part of it, of course, was growing up in South Africa and living through the apartheid era, and the movement to change the way things were. When I was a student at university, I was boarding with a guy called Van Sale Slabbert, who ran an organization, or part of an organization called IDASA. And IDASA was the organization that brought Mandela and de Klerk together to start the negotiations on the end of apartheid. So I spent a lot of time in their house, listening to discussions on the inequities and the fact that the future could not sustain with the system they had. I then worked for a company when everyone else was leaving South Africa. I worked for a company who engaged in South Africa, who wanted to use their influence to make changes on the ground. So instead of disengagement, I saw the beauty of engagement. And then along the way, I worked for a retailer who was very early on in tracing their food. It was an affiliate to Marks and Spencer's. And they would trace their food all the way back to the farm and ensure that the food that they were buying and the way that it was, the whole supply chain, including the social part of the supply chain, had a high integrity. So I was exposed to things from a very, very sort of an early stage where they were not yet kind of mainstream. And then when I took over at MEC, I had the opportunity to really change the way the organization looked at its materiality. And you know, I think that's where everyone has to start, is a really good understanding of their materiality. And what I mean by that is their impact, both positive and negative, on their stakeholders. And I think where businesses get lost, or a lot of leaders get lost, is they don't truly understand their materiality and who their stakeholders are. So they try and pull goodness out of the air instead of really bolting it into and onto the business that they run. I don't know if that makes sense. But materiality and stakeholders looks not just at your customers and your staff and your suppliers and your supply chain, but I think deep materiality also understands the natural factors, the externalities that we need to ensure that our business continue into the future. So there's a little brief.
Yeah, and I think what you just described, and I think we're probably going to touch on this a few times in the discussion that ensues, because I think what tends to be missing is that bridge between either hyperbole, and I hate to say it like that, but I think I've spoken to George and Gary in particular, where there is a growing cynicism around the, call it, value signaling, whatever it might be, but just words that are coming out without substance. And then on the other hand, organizations that want to do the right thing, but they're having a real struggle investing and figuring out how to be financially sustainable while tackling these things. And materiality might be the bridge. I think if anything, I'll maybe throw to George right now, because I think if anything's noteworthy in the news, I think there's almost a feeling like we're overplaying, be it Black Lives Matters or whatever it might be. Fundamental change is important, but just words themselves, it seems to be dominating the airwaves. And I know, George, you got a perspective on that, but I think we should start there and then start working our way back to where purpose does matter.
Yeah, I just want to, Dave,
Well,
go ahead.
before you start, sorry, can I just add one more thing? And I agree with you that the change we need to make is massive change. It's really deep change, and it's something that cannot be made overnight. But to make that change, you have to understand the complexities in your materiality and your scope 1, 2, and 3 impacts. And it's not simple. It's very, very hard, and it's very, very complex. Okay.
So I just want to clarify for everyone that when David said the word cynicism, he wasn't referring to my cynicism. He was referring to the cynicism, or Gary's, the cynicism around this subject. Although I do have some cynicism over this, David.
I would concur with that interpretation, George.
Yeah, just for an example, let's all be, carbon neutral by 2050.
Right.
Just such a weak.
Gary, I've got 7 carbon credits to sell you for that, if you like. Look, this is, David Lobster, the way you presented it was perfect for me. It's a very difficult challenge for organizations to balance themselves around the environmental issue, the social impact of those environmental challenges that they face, and how governance and operating a company fits in. So David Gray earlier started off by saying, how do we bring this together? The things that need to happen organizationally is the culture needs to change. And then you need to, other than just saying words, because a lot of organizations exist around a culture with a lot of words, a lot of staple stuff up on behind the wall that you can read, right? That George is not a cynic, that these are real things, and we buy it, but people don't believe it because the words don't match the actions. Their own employees. I wrote an article years ago on, about 10 years ago, on social responsibility. I got criticism for that, because how dare I write something like that? But social responsibility is the beginning, starting foundation to build your culture to get there, right? You can't convince an organization that you're going to be sustainable tomorrow if you don't do things organizationally that lead to that. And I just want to, before I pivot to anyone else, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that in Europe, the government is asking publicly traded companies and large private companies to create disclosure going forward around their environmental issues, what they're doing environmentally and what they're doing socially, so that they can, and they relying on the corporate governance to bring clarity and transparency to all these things, so that the government and the public understands the commitment of the organization. I can't imagine that flying over very well in North America right now. I just can't. I know that there are a lot of organizations that shudder over this whole issue. Well,
but there's also, it's funny because everyone's in a bubble whenever they're operating day to day, right? Like if it's either your family culture or your local culture or your organizational culture, it may be obvious, but we forget it, that North America, dominated by the US, has a very different, call it libertarian, survival of the fittest, maybe. I don't want to make it a negative. It's the act in your own self-interest and be unfettered to achieve an economic end. That's kind of the guiding birthstone of the United States commerce factory that kind of emerged in the 1800s onward. The European model was much more around social license. Like I think the European, and also around democracy, it's all about how society works. And I think in Europe, there's sort of a more fundamental understanding that as a business, we're giving you the opportunity to go and achieve all those things. But there are externalities, there are impacts, and you got to be sharing in the handling of those. And so I think that's why we've seen time and time again, Europe tends to be ahead on some of the business investment in this direction. So I can't speak to elsewhere in the world.
Can I just jump in, David? That's a generalization that we need to be careful about. I was on an ESG call this morning, and they were talking about this very matter and the reporting that is being required by Europe and how the rest of the world is reporting. And really, managers of equities, particularly large public companies, are increasingly across North America and Europe looking for risk in portfolios, which includes ESG risk. And one of the comments made by one of the gentlemen who is about to head to the next COP meeting is that the larger the organization and the more risky their portfolio, the better is their reporting. You know, particularly mining, for example, and large Canadian public companies with risk in their portfolio are actually fairly transparent in reporting. It's the smaller companies and the independents that struggle with it.
And imagine privately held.
Yeah, yeah.
Gary, you've operated in both parts of the world. So do you notice differences, or would you echo what you've been hearing?
Yeah, when I moved from the UK, I went into a conference, and the first thing I noticed about being here is when I came here, I had to buy loads of stuff, and there was a huge amount of packaging. That really hit me between the eyes. And I went to this conference, and they were talking about effectively ESG issues. And I remember some guy stood up and said, "I'm fed up with this. We're already super green. Why are we wasting any more time on this?" And my face must have been a picture, because coming from the UK, we were like, we've been recycling forever, and packaging standards and packaging acts were already in place. It was so much more. And when I came here, there was more to do. And I suspect Canada's ahead of south of the border. So there is a lot to do. And both as us as individuals and certainly as companies, there seems to be a considerable amount of waste in companies, just creating a profit stream. If you then ask them to turn their mind to try and do something better in terms of looking after the environment, they go, "Oh, we're just going to create waste on that as well." So I mean, this is a really pretty important message for us to kind of talk about and to get a clear message out to help retailers and perhaps wider businesses. Where do they start? Because it's easy to say, you know, we're going to achieve, as I said, carbon neutral by 2050. That doesn't make any sense at all. I'm talking about what do we do now, next quarter, the end of this year. Bear in mind we're in COVID. Maybe in 2 years' time, what's that path? That's that development path of things that we need to do and actually achieve before we can start to say we're on our path. And those impacts may or may not be adverse to the profit and loss account. Because we're making an assumption everything done over here is actually going to affect the profit and loss account. It may do in a very short term, but imagine the situation that we do things and it actually helps our profit and loss account in the longer term. And we need models that help us to see that clearly.
Gary, you know, the challenge though is that it's two-parted, right? It's the organization and then it's the customer base. Because I can't say why I know this, but I know that there are other organizations that have come to the open and said, we can move from here to here. And they proposed this to their customer base and they proposed it in terms of here's the cost implications of doing this. People don't want to hear about it, right? You can't get to that absolute level of, you know, that they're free of everything, any kind of risks, without there being a cost, because you're asking organizations and industries to evolve from their current state of whatever it is that they do to produce products, to clean their act up, to clean up their lots from all the chemicals and all the obsolescence of all of this equipment and old dishwashers and fridges that are hanging out there. All of those things need to be cleaned up because the environment just isn't the air and water. It's all the material stuff that's out there that we continue to produce and throw away. So that costs money, right? If you imagine a world where obsolescence no longer exists. How do businesses survive? And are you willing to pay 10 times for a refrigerator that's going to last maybe 50 years?
So you have about 8 awesome points in that one sentence, but I'm going to pick up on one of them. which is this notion of, cost. And back in about 2005 and 6, I got baited by people who knew me. They're saying, well, what are you doing in your retail leadership and the work we were doing to get this stuff on the agenda at retail? And I said, not much. It doesn't seem to fit there, to be honest with you, except for some very localized leaders who tended to be always leaders, like Mac. But I started going down that route. And one of the things that was happening at that time was the view that efficiency tied really strongly with the notion of stripping costs out of the system, which was a mandate of most retail in around that era. So efficiency generation was actually a good play. Walmart just owned that deeply, and they forced all their vendors to get on board. But I remember talking to a CEO, and I said, well, when you're talking about what else can you do and green products and other things that were going to come at a cost, I said, do you portfolio your environmental initiatives, or does each one have to show a positive ROI? And they said each one has to show a positive ROI. And I said, well, why is that? Why can't you bundle things where you're having some really profoundly good impacts over here, but you're paying for it through the savings elsewhere? And they'd never contemplated it. So I think some of it's belief systems and how we make decisions, and we're evolving, we're learning how to do that. But I think to say that the only answer is a customer, a shopper, has to bear the penalty, and I know David Labister's going to have something to say on this, I don't think that's the answer. I think people are busy with their own lives. And there's a few green consumers out there. There's not that many who are going to pay more or accept lesser quality or whatever it is. But for most people, it's a profound tiebreaker. If you can get everything you're getting today, but you get it greener or with better treatment of workers, you're going to pick that option, but you don't want to trade off.
Yeah, and I would agree, David. And I'm also fairly cynical of the customer, and I have a belief that that all of us wear three hats. That on the one hand, we're part of civil society, and we've got that hat sometimes, and we are part of a community, and we wear that hat sometimes, and we're consumers, and we wear that hat sometimes. And as part of the community or part of civil society, we're worried about climate change and all those issues that are so prescient right now. And we really fret about them, and we want the brands that we buy and the people that we support to do something about it. On the other hand, we are part of a local community, and we don't want social housing built in our neighborhood, or we don't want a pipeline built in our, running through our local hills, even though we drive gas cars, and we don't want the price of gas to go up either. But then on the other hand, we have this consumer beast inside of us that I want that thing and I want it. And if I want that thing, we go online, and where is the cheapest place to buy it, and how is the most, where is the most sort of convenient place to buy it, and that trumps all. So yes, I'm cynical about the consumer, and I've got a 16-year-old and a 25-year-old kid who say one thing and behave in different ways, and I see them, there's this dissonance that they can't really wrap their heads around. The other example I use is people that bag on big companies who have retirement portfolios that require those companies those public companies to return a profit, and they can't square the fact that those public companies' profits are good for their retirement while they are bagging on those public companies making profits. Having said that, I believe that the businesses that move ahead and de-risk their supply chains from an impact of carbon, water toxicity, and labor issues, even though it costs more in the short term, will win in the long term. So I think that we should do these things for the future success, profitability, and health of our organizations, even though the consumer says one thing and does another.
Well, I think this younger generation, like your Gen Z consumer, it's really important to them. And while, yes, they might live that duality that you were talking about earlier, I think they're looking to the future. They're looking to what is the world going to be like, and what have boomers slash, you know, the other generations kind of left them to now. And so I think they're looking especially to companies and brands and leaders in those brands to be very transparent, to walk the walk and talk the talk, and to be beyond just in the boardroom or in their role, but living that life and trying to speak to those values. And I think this year in particular, it's just brought forth, especially, you know, me being in the US, Black Lives Matter. You know, before that, it was the Me Too movement. There's just a lot of things going on culturally, and brands that are attaching to that. Well, before that would have been seen as very political and concerning. Now brands are actually being promoted and championed for those beliefs. So Patagonia is a great example of that, where they're not going to just stand idly by. And so consumers are, I think, really resonating with that and wanting to see change and wanting to see leaders affect change. And back to the comment around culture, I think culture is a big part of that, and embedding that culture in an organization. So there's accountabilities and responsibilities from, you know, the CEO all the way down through the organization. Because I don't think you can affect that change without that cultural shift and without people really being accountable to it. And yes, there are implications financially to that. But to your point, if we don't move forward and continue to do this, we're going to be in a really bad situation down the road.
Yeah, and Christine, I agree with you. The caveat is we have to do it in a way that's authentic with our brand.
Yeah.
You know, and we don't want a case like happened with North Face at the end of last year, where a Texas oil company wanted to buy a whole lot of their jackets and North Face turned them down. And the oil industry gave an award to North Face for using so much petroleum in the materials that they use. And of course, we know the Everlane situation. So, you know, we have to be authentic, and we have to be transparent. And I think we have to acknowledge it back to materiality, where our positive and negative benefits are. Mm-hmm. And, you know, ultimately, if we're in the business of making stuff for consumers, and consumption drives our profitability and our viability. So starting at that point and then going all the way up your supply chain and looking at the materiality, how do you run your business in the most considered way you can, and in line with authentic brand all the way through?
David, sorry, it's a great point. Your last point there was about how do you drive a brand to that. And, you know, a leader today really needs to look hard at where are we right now? Where do we really want to be 10 years from now? You need to focus down the road. And then say to yourself, what needs to, if I have a clear vision of what that is, what needs to change internally in the organization over a period of time. And then you break that down into bite-sized chunks that you move yourself gradually towards that place. But once you've said that, right, the organization is now exposed itself to the public and to its people, to the organization internally and their shareholders and stakeholders that, hey, we're about to evolve a little bit further and we're going to be down the road. I guess a great example of that is the car industry right now, right? We're seeing that transformation happening to EVs. I just read the article this morning about the number of EVs that are available in the marketplace today. I have to say Tesla still tops in terms of range ability, but that's personal. But at the end of the day, you know, that is moving in a direction. So who's going to take care of all these carbon combustion engine vehicles, right? There's a challenge. It's not just a challenge of building a company that's sustainable. It's building a sustainable world at the aftermath of all our consumption. So who cleans that up, right? You just can't leave it. I can tell you, I gotta be careful here. I can tell you that, you know, your garbage pickup, your waste management is not as clean as you think it is. That it's got to get better. I mean, we live in a very pristine little world where all our garbage is picked up on Tuesday in my neighborhood. Where does it go? Does anybody know? Right? Where does it
landfill.
where does it get dumped? Does anybody know? Right? Does it go over the border and somewhere else? I mean, there's a lot of questions.
Philippines, George. It goes on a boat to the Philippines, but then it
That's
gets turned
plastic.
back.
That's the plastic. But you understand what I'm saying is that we live in this pristine world where we think that everything is being cleaned up, but it's not perfect yet. So I push back on the idea, right? I'm pushing back that until this actually moves not just a generation of people in a country, but moves globally, it's meaningless. You have to move globally or it's meaningless. Because the moment you stop that bill, I remember reading a lady, they talked about buying jeans that are $150 a pair because they're sustainable. And the woman they interviewed said, oh no, I'm not paying $150 for a pair of jeans. I'd rather buy 5 or 3 or whatever the number was for $30 or $50 each, right? I mean, there's this mindset, but that mindset keeps thousands and millions of people overseas employed. You change that dynamic, you put more people into poverty. So there's this social aspect. You've got to get this right. You have to have a very clear vision, and organizations need to be, not just thinking broad-based, narrow-based that I'm going to impress my public. They need to be broad-based that I'm going to impress the world. And until you do that, you've got nothing on the go. That's my pitch point right here.
Well, and you also have to be fiscally sustainable. I think people forget in the triple bottom line, like that's for me, that's foundational, because you can't do good things, in the future if you're churning money and burning through it. On the other hand, I've already heard, we'll come back to it maybe, but this idea of time frame. If all you're doing is looking at the next quarter, I can't imagine you ever doing anything very meaningful. David pointed out that if you have a bit of a longer term view, the investment now can pay off to your bottom line later.
If you took 1% of all the profits you make, every organization did that, and to try and make the world sustainable and put it back in the developing countries, third world countries, who are going to end up unemployed and drinking dirty water and eating in dirty sites, you clean that up through those profits, then I'm all in. I'm all in on that. But I don't hear the investment community talking about that.
It's changing, George. It's changing quite quickly. And I think the big changes, as I mentioned earlier, are happening in large industrial companies more so than small businesses, private businesses, and I think that the textile industry is a little bit behind what's happening in mining, for example. But there's no question that the change is happening, and there's a great saying that change is slow until it isn't. And as I say, back to that call this morning, and some of the stuff that's being discussed in terms of required reporting is quite interesting. And I think that what comes out of COP is going to be quite interesting as well. And I'm optimistic that we are on the verge of fairly massive change. But I do agree with you that unless you understand your positive and negative impacts of the organization, you're just going to be greenwashing is probably not the right, but you're just going to have an idealist approach to things because, as I said earlier, this is a very, very complex environment, and solving these problems is incredibly complex. And you have to understand the complexity. Using bamboo fabric is well, maybe the fiber is sustainable, but to get that from bamboo to material requires an incredibly caustic process, which in turn requires a lot of water, a lot of chemicals, and a lot of energy. So you have to understand, the whole process. And as I say, your scope 1, 2, and 3 impacts.
I want to draw Christine back in because, and this is going to be a totally leading question. But I don't like linearity. So I like when we can get more complex. What was your experience in terms of a stated goal that was either addressing, say at Nike with factory conditions in Asia, or it could be a green initiative pointing in that direction, and then the knock-on impact in terms of just broad brush innovation or adaptability within the organization? Totally leading question. Take it from there.
Well, I was really fortunate in both my experiences at Adidas and at Nike to be involved with the sustainability organization. So in both those larger companies, they had fairly significant business models around it. And in Adidas in particular, it's my more recent experience, that was kind of at the core of everything they did. So back to the point from David Labister, like really looking at materials, going back to the source, just aligning strategies around that, also around just methods of make. So really working with factory partners, going all the way back to the source to make sure that they're really thinking thoughtfully around that. Also collaborating. So collaborating with other businesses and looking at opportunities and ways for, two brands. I'd use the Adidas Allbirds shoe that just launched, which is an incredible shoe, where you've got the best of all birds and their sustainable sourcing. And then you've taken that with Adidas and their environmental work, and you're kind of combining the two into this, circular focus on footwear. But they're across the board, unless it's from a high level from the leadership teams and it's disseminated out to the organization, it's not going to happen. It's also got to be accountability. So if it wasn't an accountability to people in their roles and in the bottom line for their bonuses, et cetera, it wasn't going to necessarily affect change as much as it would have if they were sort of accountable to that. But I think you have to set the long-term goals. And I think everyone sort of talks about, well, they're just throwing out a number and they're throwing out a goal. But if you can show meaningful progress along the way through those goals, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to put the stake in the sand and build towards that and look at across all of the levels of the business, what are the things that you're working on and what are the targets? And I'll tell you right now, no company, brand is perfect right now. They're all striving to move forward to that. But back to that comment on, the oil industry or some of those other industries, they're very transparent and they've got a plan and a strategy and they're moving towards the goal. And so I think the key is for most brands to have the sense of the understanding of where you are now and where you want to get to, and being able to kind of articulate that along the way and make sure that, you're going to trip up, and being honest and forthright about that, because consumers can see through that. They can see when things are not sort of shaping up, as in the case of some of these brands that we were talking about earlier. So I think definitely you've got to embed that into the culture, into the organization, and start to really continue to sort of focus on setting those targets. And that's across everything. So it's targets around like your sustainability and ethical nature, on making sure that across the board, you've got transparency on just how you're operating and the people that are in the organization and how they're treated. And just, it runs the gamut. It's not just as simple as the one piece of purpose. It's the whole encompassing of purpose across culture and the organization.
Yeah.
So Christine, what you're talking about makes a lot of sense, but you're coming from an organization, pretty deep pockets. It's kind of there already. Having made a lot of that transformation. Craig, you're interacting all the time with a broad array of retailers and brands. How typical is sort of that leadership role in the assortment that you're connecting in with?
It's interesting because I'm learning a lot just from this conversation. As a reporter, being an insider who's actually really an outsider, I was really highly skeptical. So I've met the founders of Allbirds. I do think they genuinely care about the environment, but I really thought, just based on my observations, that they were in the minority. I really thought most of what I was seeing was greenwashing. Say H&M, which is a massive polluter, or at least the products that it has are polluting, coming out and trying to be super eco-friendly. And, I would just shake my head and say, oh yeah, you're trying to sell more clothes, right? And you're just trying to send the message out. And I have to be honest, I just thought I was being lied to. That again, I've talked to some companies where they're great. MEC was one of them, where they were trying to be environmentally friendly. I actually believed it, but lots of companies out there, my gut feeling was, oh yeah, this is the message to try to sell more stuff. And I don't really believe what you're saying, but I'm not going to say it. And it hasn't really been so much my focus and what I've looked at, because I never figured that I was really being given an honest answer anyway. So I just kind of ignored the messaging. So I don't know. And as a consumer, yeah, I'd like to buy things that are more sustainable. And I think that would make me feel better. But buy so few things. And George, what you were mentioning about the garbage, I mean, how much of the stuff that we recycle actually ends up in the garbage? It's a fairly substantial amount, which is super disheartening, to the point where I'm just thinking, oh my God, I'm recycling. How much of this is actually going to be recycled? It just pains me, because I've got 3 bags I have to take down to the the recycling room where I live here, and I just pray to God that this stuff actually gets recycled. So I just become a skeptic at this point, and I'm trying not to say that the world is doomed, but that is sometimes how I feel. And any companies out there that can do anything that's going to help the environment, is going to be a good thing. But I hope it's not too little, too late, because you see people, surfing in the ocean, just digging up plastic all over the place. And I thought, dear God, how polluted is this world? Are we already screwed at this point? Our business is just doing this to try to get sales, because we've reached a point of no return.
Well, you know what? For that's actually very indicting and honest. Maybe the most brutally honest
Well, I think a
point
lot of them,
made,
they get caught.
point made here today. But I think maybe just on our closeout, the question would be, as an alternative to simply not making any statement as a CEO and backing away from this, what is the impetus for a CEO to actually take this more seriously?
Say nothing and do nothing if you can't just do anything, because the cancel culture will get you. That is my personal belief. What will happen to companies if they put something on the table and they cannot deliver it?
But I guess that's not what I'm framing. I'm framing, why aren't they putting something more substantive in play? Is there a good reason not to? Could be fiscal, or is there something that needs to get reframed for leaders?
David's gonna say something profound, but I'm going to say something.
I was just going to say I don't agree with George, because we and as did Nike, actually, we set out our goals and we were public about them, and every year we stated our goals, and we, in our financial report, we had a combined report, we would state how were doing against those goals. We were also attacked on many things, and we were criticized for doing many things that we said, you know what, this is not material to our business and we're not taking it on. And again, that goes back to materiality. Our impacts, both positive and negative, are these things, and we're going to focus on these things. And I think if you set goals and are transparent about them, if they are tightly integrated with your impacts and your materiality, you will not get canceled. It's when you start stepping beyond that the canceling happens.
That's what I'm getting at, though, David. It's that is the part where you're going to get screwed, right?
Yes.
I mean, as a board director and as a chair, I will always challenge the process in saying that if just do the things you say you can do. Don't go over a limb and promise something that you can't do, because it will come back to haunt you. I've seen it over and over again.
So, George, I think there's a nuanced difference between what I'm saying and you're saying. I'm saying set goals, even if they're very bold goals that are aligned to your materiality. And even if you miss them, that's fine. I don't think you have to be conservative about setting goals.
No, you don't have to be. But if you have no plan to deliver them, plan to deliver them, right? So that's what I'm coming from. I mean, you can make all the bold statements you want, but if you can't deliver it, what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, and my concern is, and I sort of have a third concern, which is then the easy out is to shrug and go, okay, well, we just won't make any plans and we won't set the goals. I actually do believe there's a business reason and a risk management reason for doing these things.
Well, it's absolutely risk management.
And Christine, I don't think it's always about the customer, because I think if you happen to have that right sweet spot of a customer who has the money and the willingness and the engagement, and often if you're young and your parents are paying for everything, it's a little easier. When you suddenly go to college and you're now stretching your tuition into things, in our research, that's where we see people really trying to stretch and go cheaper. But the answer at the end of the day is all of the above. It's really finding a way to innovate and create product that is at a cost point that people can buy, and it hits a lot of the check boxes, and it's looking after these things. And if we're smart enough to do a lot of things we do, if we focus on it, we'll figure that out.
I'd like to sort of throw a few things on the table before we wrap up. It's really sort of somewhat leveraging off of what David said a few times here, which is about the complexity of these issues that they're interplaying, in the sense of if I do it this way, then there's other implications here, and trying to unpuzzle that. Well, yeah, it is complex, and maybe we're at individual company level. And I think that's where the transformation has to take place. It can't be the customer. The customer can be encouraged to go on a journey, but the company has to do something. But it must have the skills. And if you think about where most people have come through in their business training, their business development, have been make profit, just find ways of making profit better. And there's almost a hubris that what we're doing now is at an ideal level of efficiency. And I can drive a coach and horses through any geographically extended supply chain and probably find ways that there are better ways of doing things, which may or may not be sustainable. But whatever company thinks it's at the most efficient point, I bet it isn't. And there's also the steady state mindset, which says, I think we talked about a triple lock earlier on, which is another stabilizing factor, which says, well, I'm looking after this, that, and the other, but really I'm looking after profit as well. And I can't do anything to do over here because it will upset this balance. So there's so many things that are happening and steered by management teams, which may or may not be skilled, may or may not have a long-term vision, may or may not have a view that they're the most efficient way that they can be, and therefore everything else is a downgrade from where we are. I think that in some ways some of this problem is a bit more simple, and that I think we have to. Well, I'm proposing that it's companies that have to make the change, not customers. It's not government. Government can set the regulations, maybe force us to think about things in the right way by setting up metrics which are auditable. But I think that we need to add certain skills into our how to run a business menu, which we haven't probably done a very good job on.
Can I do a quick hot pursuit on that, please?
Yes, please.
So Gary, we had a lot of success in what was a relatively small company. And I think the reason we did is that we put goals, sustainability goals, into the jobs of the people that knew what they were doing. So our supply chain footprint we gave to our logistics people. Our chemical and toxicity and material footprint we gave to our material people and our material engineers and our sourcing people. The footprint of our stores we gave to our ops manager. And they know how things work. And once they have the goals, they come up with the most amazingly creative stuff, but they have to buy into it.
Well, if I see any leading indicator for me that an organization isn't quite ready yet, it's when I run into a director of sustainability or a VP of sustainability, and they don't have any sort of direct seat at the strategic table. And that happens way more often than you'd like to think. But that's the difference right there, David, I think, between what you did and what a lot of other organizations are stuck with. I think as we always get into with these, I think we could keep going, but we're going to have to wrap it up. So many ideas, but I think just in sum up, to get past the hype, it's got to really be integrated into business. And I love, David, your idea of using materiality as the core filter for that, because we got to focus somewhere. I also think, and Christine, when I was talking about Nike earlier, I think what I've seen happen is when organizations really get real about this stuff, they find that they start getting more innovative in many other ways as well. which I would suggest to a leader today that if your retail brand is stuck and you're just making your way through the pandemic, but what happens next? What a great way to do a refresh, because there has to be a why behind rallying people. I think people will rally more about something like that than just saying, hey, we have to get our profits up. And again, I agree, Gary, it's not about the customer really. Like, they'll come along for the ride, but make it far more fundamental. And obviously, if you have a long-term view, it's going to be easier. So this, my thinking's been really honed in today. Anyway, thank you, David Labistour, and thanks everyone else, Gary Newbury, Craig Patterson, George Minikakis, and of course, Christine Cowan. And until next time, this is David Ian Gray with The Business of Retail.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.